I'm Rosalie Harden, Executive Producer of Faith and Finance. Welcome today to the last of our series of webinars on building a just and loving economy. We've had previous conversations about the deep connections between faith and finance and how people of faith can help reimagine a new economy with rules that work for all of God's people, not just the top 2%. We've also had conversations about why it's so important for us to come together in a place that's beyond the normal rugged individualism that we sometimes hold so dear, and to work for the common good. Today, our conversation will be different. It's going to be among some people who are on the creative edge of helping entrepreneurs actually make change for good in this world. That was one of the deep joys of my work at SOCAP, was bringing entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs who were creating businesses for good together. Moderating our conversation today is Stuart Yasgur, Vice President and Global Group Member of Ashoka. Ashoka is an international organization that supports and promotes social entrepreneurship, and they've recently taken a special interest in entrepreneurs of faith. So it's a pleasure to have Stuart join us for this conversation at Faith and Finance. In conversation with Stuart will be a dear friend, Coté Soerens. Coté is a mom to 3 boys and grows a huge network of friends, fellow travelers, and thirsty colleagues out of her community-based coffee shop, Resistencia, in South Park, Seattle. She and her husband, Tim, have an amazing vision about how people of faith can flip the assets of their neighborhood. And finally, another dear friend, Stephen Lewis from FTE, the Forum for Theological Exploration, is bringing to us innovative work that they have done at FTE when they started an incubator for faith-based entrepreneurs. He and his colleague, Kimberly Daniel, have just released a very helpful new book, A Way Out of No Way, offering their ideas about how we might approach Christian innovation with a fresh take and a real gift to this space. I cannot wait to hear what these folks have to say about what's happening in their worlds and how they see this space of innovation and faith and entrepreneurs moving forward. So Stuart, I'm going to turn it over to you now. We're excited to be hearing what you have to say.
Is political.
Hello, everybody, and thank you.
Does he want to change these rules?
Great. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. My name is Stuart Yasgur, and I'm with Ashoka, and I'm excited to be able to invite you here to the conversation with Coté Soerens and Stephen Lewis. We're going to dive right in. I think there's a lot of interesting work that's happening. The format for today is we're going to, Coté, Stephen, and I will each share a little bit about our work.
That's great.
And then we will break into questions. There's a chance for everybody in all the participants to ask questions and contribute. So please, as we're going through and having a conversation, please add your questions to the Q&A. We'd love to make it as interactive and question-based as possible. So with that, without anything further, Coté, I'd love to turn it over to you. Can you please share with us a little bit about your work, the work that you're doing in Seattle?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. It's quite an honor to be in this panel today with such an interesting crowd, just looking at the chat and seeing where I recognize some names and places where people are doing really interesting things. So I hope that my experience, I mean, there is so much expertise just in the people who have tuned in that I can tell you a little bit about what we are set out to do here in Seattle. I live in the South Park neighborhood of Seattle, which is the lowest earning, youngest, and most Latino neighborhood in the city. We moved here 8 years ago with a commitment to becoming part of this neighborhood and part of what aches and also blesses this neighborhood. And when we came in, our neighborhood, I need to tell you, it's a living grant proposal. Like it's we are a super fund, not a super fund, a super fund. We have the Duwamish River, which is very polluted by industry. We have highways cutting through our neighborhood. Our schools are not great. There is a host of things. But there's also something really beautiful about our neighborhood, which is you have the main version and then the subversion of the neighborhood, which is there's a lot of civic energy and a lot of people who care deeply about this. We are a square mile. We're very isolated from the rest of the city. So that has created an environment that if you're here, you have to be here. And that's why people talk to each other on the street, which is unusual in Seattle. So in this particular environment, as a person of faith, as a person who does ministry, we really had to start thinking about what does financial justice and equitable systems look like here in this neighborhood. And that has led us into quite an interesting journey. We first realized that the foundation of it all, for us at least, was relationships between neighbors. We had this main version of South Park, which is like, we're so needy, we have so many problems. But that was very different from our experience. And we thought we needed to create some infrastructure for people to connect and live out that those assets that the neighborhood has. And one of the main issues that we recognized from the beginning was that if you look at the neighborhood, the built environment of the neighborhood, it didn't really tell the story of who we are. The retails were empty, there were no places to connect. So by way of just gathering people at our home on a weekly basis for soup night, different initiatives started to come up. And one of them, the first one, was Resistencia Coffee, which we opened in 2018. And that Resistencia Coffee, our coffee shop in the neighborhood, is basically not only a love letter to South Park, but also we have been incredibly intentional about how we run this company in a way that actually brings wealth back into the neighborhood. So, for example, at some conversation with the same crowd, we had dialogue around, well, it's a coffee shop in a gentrifying neighborhood. Are you part of that? And not because we have really also intentionally taken on the importance of real estate and importance of access to place and community controlled spaces. So Resistencia, we have not really stopped at having all investment for that money to be from the neighborhood, hiring people from the neighborhood, even if they did not have experience as baristas. We have been intentional and very stubborn about, we are hiring from our neighborhood. We are sourcing things from our neighborhood, and we are hosting this space as a community controlled space where we recognize that many entrepreneurs around don't have access to retail. Therefore, they can actually use our space as an incubator, try new products. And it has a lot of challenges to do that, but it is worth it to us, because what we wanted Resistencia Coffee to be was not only an accelerator of social capital, but also an example of what can happen within hyperlocal economies. We did not stop there, though. Out of doing this accelerator of social capital, a number of other initiatives came about, like the Arts Collective. We created a community development association, Cultivate South Park, and we have been very intentional about start looking at real estate in our neighborhood. And currently, I personally have been part of the equitable development movement here in Seattle. I'm part of the Equitable Development Initiative, the board. I'm in the executive council of a new PDA, which is the Cultural Space Agency, aimed at retaining and making real estate accessible for communities of color and art and the arts in the city of Seattle, which is, as you know, Seattle is a cautionary tale when it comes to real estate. So these are very important initiatives. But when it comes to the neighborhood, right now we're in the middle of a very important transaction of a piece of real estate in the neighborhood that is key to the destiny of our neighborhood. And we are learning a lot about access to capital, access to leveraging for people who have a lot of like us, we have so many connections, we know so many people. How is it that we can get a mortgage for this, for example? We are learning so much about how banking is structured and trying to create new entities, new ways to disrupt this, so that everybody in the neighborhood can actually engage and in investment in real estate and grow with the neighborhood. And I can geek about that for hours, so probably I should like wrap it and, and pass it on to Stephen.
That's wonderful, Coté. Just wonderful work that you're doing. And my name is Stephen Lewis. I serve as president of the Forum for Theological Exploration. I'm also a co-founder and the creator of Do Good X, which is a 10-week startup accelerator for underrepresented, aspiring entrepreneurials who are working at the intersection of faith and social entrepreneurship. And the work of FTE really is about cultivating a new generation of leaders who will make a difference in the world through Christian ministry, teaching, and their leadership within congregations and neighborhoods and parishes, et cetera. And a few years ago, what we realized is that not everybody wants to be a pastor, not everybody wants to be an organizer, not everyone wants to do the things that you find, typical religious leaders doing. But what we do know is that particularly the next generation is interested in the question of, how their faith speaks to the larger issues and conditions in the world. And so part of the reason and why we developed Do Good X and this accelerator is acknowledging the idea that people of faith have always been first responders, not only just to their communities, but also in this nation with regards to the multiple ways in which our country has disenfranchised different groups. And in the effort of progress, have also left some individuals behind. And so what does that mean for us as people of faith? What is our role? What is our witness within the broader community? And really what we try to think about is entrepreneurship as an extension to those who want to organize and mobilize on behalf of justice. And so part of the question then becomes, how do you think about the ways in which your values are institutionalized beyond your organizing and your mobilizing? What are the ways in which people of faith can marry what they bring in terms of their ethics, in terms of their values, with the stuff of organizations and businesses, and actually trying to be what my colleague Matthew Williams, who's the president of ITC, the Interdenominational Theological Center, would say, prophetic problem solvers through entrepreneurship, in the ways in which they're coming up with solutions to long-standing systemic issues within their own particular settings in order to bring more about this new heaven and new earth that we see John the Revelator talking about. And so in that sense, Do Good X is trying to address that. But the other thing that what we think is unique about what we're doing is acknowledging the idea is that typically the entrepreneurship eco space is very homogenous and does not bring enough diversity to the space. And oftentimes the people who get funded to do the good work, at least they're trying to do in the world, are really concerned about the needs of the elite few. But there are time and time everyday people who are in neighborhoods that Coté has mentioned, and who are in neighborhoods that look more like in our expression of Black and brown folks within this country, that are doing innovative, creative, imaginative, entrepreneurial kinds of things that are worthy of investment, that are worthy of support, and are worthy of people kind of organizing and mobilizing their resources to support these types of entrepreneurs. So we focus on underrepresented, particularly women and people of color in Do Good X, because one, we're trying to diversify the field, but two, we also recognize is that diversity is a superpower. Diversity is like the pH balance in a nutrient-rich soil that allows for the creativity and imagination, but also the kind of solutions that benefit more of us versus a few of us. And so in Do Good X, we're kind of up to that kind of work, and hopefully trying to find the kind of leaders that match in our embedded in neighborhoods that Coté has been mentioned.
That is fantastic. Thank you both, Coté and Stephen. Stephen, I'm going to cite you when I quote you that diversity is a superpower. I think it's a potent way of encapsulating kind of a powerful idea. I'll reciprocate as kind of a panelist slash moderator. So my name is Stuart Yasgur. I'm with Ashoka. Some of you may be familiar with Ashoka. Ashoka is the organization that introduced the idea of social entrepreneurship. And I should say for a social entrepreneur for Ashoka is not necessarily someone who's created a social enterprise, but a social entrepreneur is a person with a systems-changing new idea that has the potential to change the pattern in society at the regional or continent-wide level scale. And so Ashoka has been, 40 years ago, introduced that idea, has been seeking to build that field since. We're in about 90 countries around the world. And we look at over 10,000 new ideas a year to find the 1 to 200 who really meet that criteria. And you may all know and work with Ashoka Fellows. There are now more than 4,000 of them in the United States and in countries around the world. The work that I do at Ashoka is I lead something called the Economic Architecture Project. And it's really based on a couple of ideas that I think might be friendly to a number of folks who are here joining us in the conversation today. Now, the first is that markets can be an incredibly powerful tool to improve people's lives. And the next part of that is that, unfortunately, markets work extraordinarily well for a very small number of people on the planet. But for the vast majority of people on the planet, our markets are not working nearly as well as they could. And when we see that our markets are failing us, we need to recognize that we have the ability, the opportunity, and really the responsibility to redesign the structure of our markets. So when people pursue profit, it inherently furthers the public good. And so our goal in economic architecture is to do for economic architecture what Ashoka did for social entrepreneurship, which is help build that field. So that in a short period of time, when we see our markets failing us, we won't just have a conversation about how we get more growth with limited levels of inflation. Instead, we'll start to have a conversation about how do we really redesign this so it works for everybody in our society. And we seek to do that by working on problems that we think are of historic importance. So for example, one of the major efforts we have going on right now is we're partnering with the Brookings Institution. And I think our co-conspirator in that work, Andre Perry, was here at one of the earlier sessions, because we're looking at the fact that homes in Black majority neighborhoods in this country have been devalued significantly. Very much in the spirit of what Coté and Stephen have shared, the view that we bring to it is that there's not a single silver bullet solution. Rather, there are innovators and communities proximate to the problem across the country who are wrestling with the problem, developing innovative new approaches to it. And what we need to do is to help foster that new generation of structural innovations. And that means seeing innovators where they are in communities across the country, helping to bring together the partners that they'll need to succeed, and helping people to recognize the importance and significance of the work that they're doing. And I would, so that's an example of how we do this work of helping to build the field of economic architecture. And I'd add one thing that I think might be germane to this topic. I think when we talk about these big questions about how to create a just and loving economy, it can seem like very big questions. They can be theoretical questions, and they can seem enormous. And they are big questions. But one of the things I want to bring to the front is that we can make progress on these questions through actions of each individual stepping forward to make change where they are. And so I would just point to one specific example, which is a problem that's emerging in Seattle, and it's emerging in Houston and Washington, D.C., and New Orleans, Detroit, Baltimore, and cities all across the United States, is that all too often with economic development comes the displacement of communities who have long been in those cities, who have not just homes, but also communities in those cities, and who could most benefit from development instead are getting displaced as development comes into those cities. So we just did one of the innovations that we're supporting through this work is an approach called community land trusts. And it's a powerful approach which says, look, land is scarce. It's a limited resource. And if we use it as a store of wealth, the price of land is going to go up. and it's going to it's going to exceed the grasp of those who don't have the resources to secure it. But housing is a universal need and needs to be universally accessible. Secure housing should be a right for everyone. So how do we actually do this? So what Community Land Trust have done is actually separate out, for example, the ownership of the land from the ownership of the buildings. And what that does is it makes ownership of the buildings don't appreciate at the same rate because buildings are a depreciating asset. So it enables cities to create secure, long-term, permanently affordable housing in neighborhoods that are experiencing development. So we're starting to see this emerge. It's emerging in Seattle. We're seeing in California. We're seeing in Houston, DC, and a number of cities across the United States. So it's a big change. It's a change in the structure of our market in home ownership. But that change came about because in the 1960s, Black farmers were getting displaced from their land, and they realized they needed to push back against it. And so they're the ones who actually developed this model. Informed by leaseholder approaches in the UK, they introduced a new model of land ownership in the United States that's now taking root and growing in cities across the country. And so I just want to leave with that one last example. It's an example of the way that individuals, wherever they stand, can actually step forward to redesign the basic structures of our markets in an important way. So with that, I'd like to turn to a couple of questions. Coté and Stephen, you both talked about working with innovators and entrepreneurs in local contexts. And it's a big part of work that we do. I think so much of entrepreneuring is also about how-tos. What are you finding and what can we share with people in the call today who might be doing something similar, the how-tos that are enabling you to succeed, that are enabling you to work with entrepreneurs and help them stand up in the ways that you are?
I'm sorry, sir. Did you say the how-tos?
The how-tos, how are you doing the work? What's the insights that you're learning that's enabling you to succeed?
Okay. I also wanted to bring up Ivan Gonzalez has really good questions about spirituality and informing the work, which to me is the base of my how-to. So yes, and Stephen, probably you're much better at the practicalities of this question. Why don't you open? I did the first one. I just needed the clarification of the how-to. You're on mute.
Thank you, Coté. We're just kind of addressing the latter question, the why, which I think kind of shapes the how-to, is this idea that, even in the pandemic, I mean, we, particularly those who are part of Christian communities globally, particularly in the United States, and where I'm situated here in Atlanta in the South, understand the pandemic is a kind of apocalyptic moment. And, in this sense of it, it is about the unveiling of what is, realizing that the American dream in the project has never worked for all of us. And the same thing, apocalyptic is also unveiling what is possible. And so the book of Revelation is one of these types of apocalyptic literature, right? And specifically, it talks about in its 21st and 22nd chapter, this unveiling of a new heaven and a new earth. And that, in the middle of this is this kind of image that kind of harkens back to the Eden story, which is this tree that is for the healing of all nations. And so in many ways, I'm thinking about the kind of new heaven and new earth in our communities, in our cities, that is possible, as Stuart has named, when we all kind of roll up our sleeves and we think about what is beneficial beyond our kind of rugged individualism, but for the good of the neighbor, right? And so in that sense, when we think about this kind of compelling vision of a new heaven and a new earth, when we think about abundant life that works for everyone, when we think about it in a juxtaposition to the American project that has never worked for all of us, particularly those who are particularly more darker melon, and those of us who have low social, economic status within this country, this is an opportunity where we all can get involved. And so many of the entrepreneurs that I'm working with come to this work with an idea and want to they really have this idea that they want to kind of help solve a problem in their community. And one important how-to is really around the education. How do you educate them, not only just about business, but how do you educate them on the problem? Because here's the thing, right? Which is people can have all kinds of ideas. And when I think about ideas, many of my ideas can be fleeting. But what I really want people to be committed to and invested in is the issue. Because if you can stay with the issue long enough, you will come up with, or maybe your idea will pivot and evolve and change over time as you learn more about it. And so I love this idea of kind of the economic architecture, because part of, if you're going to have faith and finance, church folks in general and Christian people in particularly in this community have to become more astute and educated and sophisticated in matters of money, but also matters of economics and economic systems and macroeconomics and microeconomics, not just in terms of a nation state versus what takes place in business, but also how that money happens in communities, about production and the ways in which it's consumed, and interest rates and credit and debit and those types of tax liabilities and tariffs that all impact the way in which we participate in the economic system that we find ourselves. And so one important kind of how-to is really about educating them on the systemic issue in which their problem is addressing or pertaining to, but also educating them on the dollars and cents of economics and what it means to participate in the economy and to be more conscious of the way in which their business will participate in the larger economy in hopes of bringing about the kind of good that they want to see. So education is a really important piece to that. The other thing that I would say that in terms of a how-to is really thinking about this idea of how do we help people understand that, much of, how do I say it? Much of what entrepreneurs have been able to do in this country is not because of their sheer talent or their sheer skill or gift. Oftentimes it's what our entrepreneurs have been reading. This guy, Chris Rabb, who's a politician, but he was an entrepreneur beforehand, but he has this book called Invisible Capital. And his whole thing is about how do you actually make people aware of the ascribed economic, capital, cultural, and social capital that is so important to developing businesses. It's not just about how smart you are. It's not just about the skill sets. Oftentimes it's about the who you know, and it's about the network and access to resources and exposure that helps a person be successful or not. That's not to say that, being smart is not important. It is, but it's also recognizing that not everyone has pulled themselves up by their bootstrap. It goes back to what you said, Stuart, about, when you think about these farmers, a large part of it is about the laws and it's about policy that has privilege and benefits certain groups over another. And so how do you educate people, but also recognize the type of invisible capital that they bring to the table when they're trying to develop a particular business? And then lastly, I'll just say, another how-to is really thinking about how do you help entrepreneurs emancipate their emaciated imagination? Too often in communities, particularly religious communities, they're bombarded with so much that is coming at them. They don't have breathing space. They don't have breathing space to be able to take a pause and to imagine what could be possible, because they're dealing with matters of, particularly within communities of color, they're dealing with flesh and blood matters of life and death. And so part of this is about how do you help church people, and particularly those who want to do the type of entrepreneurial, innovative work, to broaden their imagination. And to broaden their imagination oftentimes mean that they have to be dislocated from their own center, right? To be at the margins of other worldviews and perspectives, and to be a student and learning. And that can help broaden the imagination, but it also can expose them to what's already happening in the neighborhood that they're unaware of. Because the people that they have not considered their neighbor is their neighbor. And so the more that we can actually expose them to a broader diversity, again, that becomes the rich soil by which we can help broaden their imagination about what's possible. To do the type of economic architecture that I think you're talking about and what Coté is mentioning in her work, and it requires a kind of not just prophetic imagination, not just kind of pastoral imagination, but it requires a kind of economic imagination. And to have that kind of imagining, we have to be able to see from different points of views and perspectives that are different than ours.
Well, Stephen, I like where you're going with that, because there seems to be a whole theological shift around how we're understanding. So away from the more what I understand to be the more traditional evangelical theology that, I don't know, was so popular in the 90s and I grew up with back in Chile, made it that way. But in going to one of the questions that was posed, in the how-tos, to me, this whole notion of entrepreneurship and shifting of economic landscapes has everything to do with a spiritual discipline. I love one of the greatest gifts that my husband, Tim, has given me is this operating question that he asks all the time. What are God's dreams for this neighborhood? And to me, as you know, I'm curious, I'm enthusiastic, I care about so many things. Actually adopting the neighborhood as the place where I actually care about. I care about so many things, right? Renaissance woman, you know, but focusing all that energy and imagination in a particular place, that to me has been the first step into achieving anything. Because when you are focused in this particular place, first, you can take more of like a permaculture type of approach where somebody's project and entrepreneurship can nurture somebody else's attempt to do something big. The second piece on why faith is so important to this work is that when you ask what are God's dreams for the neighborhood, you get in the business of doing things that are actually newsworthy and innovative. I personally, you know, it's interesting for me how that has shifted my imagination. It's like, okay, we set up the business, and Resistencia is a darling of the impact investing and local, like whatever, the whole like economic. I'm blanking on the name of the whole sector of a social capital, social markets, whatever. And we could have ended there, right? Like, oh, great, we did that. Let's go to let's just rest, and it was not possible. You're consistently thinking about how, if you have God's dreams for this neighborhood, it's like, okay, what are God's dreams for my neighborhood? That everybody has a roof over their heads, that people are not afraid of being outside, that the youth have good places to be. And there is this notion of abundance, actually, of God is doing the work, you're just joining it. God, the Spirit is moving, and your spiritual practice is to discern where is the Spirit moving, how can we be the hands and feet of Jesus in this particular place, right? And that posturing, I think, is incredibly powerful, because first, it decenters you from the story. You become somebody who's just trying to facilitate things, right? Alongside other people who are also trying to facilitate things. And it creates a more collaborative environment that is actually perfect for entrepreneurship. The newsworthy component is, okay, we can do the nonprofit, we can do the thing, but what is actually innovative? What is actually daring? Is actually messing with economic systems? What is the crazy thing that no one thought about? And the crazy thing that no one thought about comes not from like just be crazy, it comes from our people who are struggling and in poverty, need daring solutions. They need crazy solutions. They need people to take risks on their behalf. So that is where the daring thing comes. Like, nobody thought about just giving a 0 interest loan, you know, or like but that's what they can do. And I love them. So I want them to have that. But that comes from being in the neighborhood, in relationship. And the other is newsworthy. It's like, what are actual good news, and good news in the sense of the gospel? What are good news for this neighborhood? Right now, good news for this neighborhood in South Park is the ability to stay in the neighborhood. People love this neighborhood and they can't live here anymore. They can't afford it. So what is that daring solution? I love what you were saying, Stuart, about the community land trust. We've gone a little different direction. I personally love it when everybody gets to make money. My problem is not that people make money. It's like, I just want everybody to be able to make money. And the biggest problem for our neighbors, particularly immigrants, people of color, is the access to intergenerational wealth and creation of assets. So I actually have been more positioning myself to be able to play the game in a way that we can like make everybody else access it. So we have our neighbor in Georgetown, San Ferrasino, who is doing very similar work, but in a nonprofit way. And we had this conversation once about, hey, is this like first wave feminism with like now like third wave feminism, as in like owning the land and not owning the land and whatever. And he actually did say something. He said, like, I think the reason I'm going about it as a nonprofit is because I'm a white guy. As in people in this side of the river, actually like this might be the only opportunity they have to own any asset that they can pass on to their children. And that matters to us. It's like, okay, you need something to pass on to your children. We have something to pass on to our children, but you don't, you know? So how do we create the entire system in a way that this is actually meaningful to you? So then we take examples around the country. For example, the Community Investment Trust by Mercy Corp in Portland, that they do have this system that Mercy Corps own this big commercial property, and they allow like, I don't know, 5 to 10% of the property to be co-owned by people in the same zip code, and they get a dividend. It's a little bit like REI, the co-op, you get a little dividend at the end. We thought, okay, that has good skeletons, but it's not daring enough. We want the neighborhood to own the neighborhood. So we're in the process right now of exploring the idea of, to create we're calling it the Barrio Trust. So we are in the process of pulling up the funding and the timeline that we need to acquire this really strategic property in the neighborhood. It would be very easy for us as a nonprofit to own it and call it good. We put it in the neighborhood, now we'll develop it in affordable housing, whatever. But that is not what our neighbors have been saying. What our neighbors have been saying is that they want access to own the neighborhood collectively, to have a say in where the neighborhood is going, how many parks we have, what amenities do we have. So what we're trying to create is a structure where South Park residents are eligible to be part of the Barrio Trust and own the property in a much more significant way that we have seen in other parts of the country. And again, that might be a crazy thing. It's been difficult. It's been difficult to find legal help to make that happen because it hasn't been done in that way before. But it's daring, and it comes from love for my neighbors and seeing like, okay, from their perspective, this is their one shot. And another thing that I want to contest a little bit is this notion of church people and the neighborhood, the way you were getting at, Stephen. Church people are neighbors too.
Sometimes they're not, though.
Yes, and I speak of a higher problem with extractive economies and consumerism and the religious life. So that's going back to spiritual practices of locating oneself and be in a neighborhood where you actually need to be accountable to and responsible for. Because driving to hear an amazing preaching and sermon and whatever, and going back is one thing. Being embedded in a neighborhood where if the Barrio Trust doesn't work and my neighbors are really mad at me, I'm going to have to move. That puts me in a very different position as far as where, how I need to go about the work, how we need to go about the work. So I would encourage everybody to look into ways in which they can live out their faith and follow Jesus where they where they're at, because I feel that brings a level of accountability that the church needs right now. more of that at parishcollective.org.
That is great. And one, I'm reminded that I should remind everybody, please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. There's some great questions that are starting to come in. We will try and pick them out. One piece that I would, so I think, Coté, thank you so much for pushing back and challenging, it brings to mind that that I may have unintentionally said something that is not what I intended to say, is that I think one of the things that's remarkable about CLTs or other alternative ownership models like the kind you're talking about, where people can own the neighborhood, is it's not to say, okay, let's create a space where people engage with each other outside of the market. Those are important. They are critically important.
I didn't mean as a response to your project.
No, okay. I was just underlining this point. Is part of it is, how do we think, with the creative imagination, to redesign the market so that ownership of your neighborhood kind of is a means also for expressing voice and in sharing in neighborliness with your neighbors of what do we collectively want this to form? How do we want to form this? And using empathy to understand who the others are in your neighborhood and how you're going to work together in doing that. So I think those are important themes in the work that you mentioned. There's some great questions here about kind of the role that faith is playing in both of your works. And I think you've touched on this to a certain extent, but can you share some of that more explicitly? Does spirituality and faith play a significant role in all you do, and how does it inform your work?
I personally, I think it informs all of it. I think that Jesus was pretty clear around what social justice looked like and what reconciliation looked like and what love of neighbor, particularly love of neighbor, looks like. It's been interesting because getting into more, again, I'm talking from the perspective of somebody who, again, I moved to the States 16 years ago. I should not be messing with commercial real estate right now. Like I'm not a real estate agent. I'm just a random girl who just is fresh off the plane, basically. But I don't think I would have gotten into this line of thinking or line of situation if it wasn't for wanting to see what God's dreams look like here. And it's hard work and it's disheartening. Sometimes you have all the hopes and dreams of a community wrapped into a transaction that doesn't go through, and also the ability to create community around a common dream. Sometimes, so the majority of people that I share life with in mission in the neighborhood are not of faith. The people who are very engaged every day. And when it comes to community, so one of the biggest challenges in South Park is that there is no space for community. Right now, at this moment, there is not a big room where youth can gather, for example. Also, there is the pandemic, but even then, like an arts class, like we can't do it. There is nowhere to do it. And at some point, our friend was hosting one of those spaces and she had to leave because of, lack of income for an event space during COVID, during the pandemic. But she was also very upset because the landlords were being very unfair to her. And truly, I think they were kind of unnecessarily, I'm so sorry. English is my second language, guys, as you may have already noticed. They were being hostile without reason, basically. So at that moment, we're all hurting because we love this space. We have experienced so many moments together collectively in this space around the arts and bringing community. And she, of course, is incredibly hurt. And there is a racial justice component to this whole interaction that, it's like she wants to go out to the press and she wants to, take these people down. And at that moment, we were like, hey, we have to be disciplined because if we want to buy this building eventually for the community, we can't, it's not strategic for us to do that. And it was really interesting for us to come up collectively with a common language around spirituality and we all prayed that day. We all prayed about this building and what it meant to the neighborhood. And we came together in prayer. And I, in a way, had to become a pastor, had to take more of a pastoral role in that interaction. and you know, hold the space for prayer and for encouragement in a time that it was very difficult and our lives, you know, our livelihoods were at play. It was an important sacred moment, and we had to facilitate it again from the Spirit. So that's, I guess, what I'm trying to say is there is no scenario in which I would be in this situation if I wasn't a Christian.
Yeah, I mean, faith and spirituality plays a really important role in our work. But I also know that those words and terms mean different things to different people. So,
Yeah.
you know, I'm not sure what the person is asked. I don't want to assume that I know what the person is asking in that regards or whatever. But if it's a question of, you know, do we get together and pray and do Bible study and that type of thing? No, we're not a church. But if that's what spirituality means, then, you know, I think that doesn't take the expansive way in which, you know, spirituality is involved, engaged in our work. I mean, we use Jesus as a model who, you know, is in constant conflict with the powers that be. You know, oftentimes what I say is, you know, Jesus was a young adult, born to a teenage mother of low socioeconomic status, who was at odds with the powers that be. And so in that sense, to be followers of that kind of revolutionary author of our faith is the calling to also not only just be to call, you know, call to power the truth or whatever, but it also means about how do you build businesses? How do you build community? How do you shape and form people in ways that are reflective of, you know, of what he taught and what he was about? And so for us, you know, one of the things I keep coming back to is this idea of, you know, of neighbor. And so I'm thinking about, for instance, you know, this passage in Luke, you know, that talks about, you know, the Good Samaritan. You know, Jesus, you know, he's talking to one of the lawyers. And, you know, they asked him, we know the story, they asked him, you know, so how do we inherit eternal life? And Jesus asks us, you know, well, what's written in the law? But there's a piece that we always overskip. That next sentence says, how do you read it? Because oftentimes how we see shapes the way that we read scripture, and it also shapes the way in which we embody the life of faith, how we see. And for, at least, you know, for us or whatever, we acknowledge that God has preferential treatment. God's starting point is with the least among us.
Yeah.
God's starting point is with the disenfranchised. God's starting point is with the under-resourced and the undervalued. That's my reading. That's how I see it. And so when we think about entrepreneurship, how do we embody that in God's starting point is with women and people of color. God's starting point are those who do not receive the majority of venture capital. God's starting point is the ones who can benefit from the resources that have been codified for the elite few to be given to the least among us, to be able to address the issues and the concerns within the Jerusalems within our own community, with the people who consider to, you know, to be underserved in that regard. So in that regards, spirituality is a very important component of what we do, not just as our identification, but it also it shapes our worldview and our imagination about justice and about peace and about the access of abundant life for more of us. And so, you know, just as an example, I'm thinking, you know, so if you have a value, if you value abundant life for all, and I'm working with someone like Coté who says, you know, we want to figure out, like, how does all own its neighborhood? One of the ways to do this, think about like, how could we reimagine ESOPs, employment stock options, and put that together with REITs, where we actually then think about how all the land and property within communities are set up in some type of REIT that then the community has some type of reimagined ESOP where everyone, not just employee, maybe it's not an ESOP, maybe it's a INSOP, where the neighbors own stock in the real estate by which all of our properties sit on. That's something that we can do within our kind of economic structure as it is. But all that is based off of not only just a theological value, but a spiritual value of abundant life for everyone, holding all things in common, those kind of things. So, those are just kind of my, initial musings as I think about, the question around spirituality, because it is important. And I think people should not shy away from it. But I think also the community and religious leaders have to learn how to be polylingual. They got to be able to speak, and they have to be the translators and interpreters and be able to speak not just in their own language, but they also got to be able to speak in the language of the market and the economy, and also understand what the translation of that is. So one of the things I'm thinking about, for instance, public policy is about legislating values. Yes, it's concerned about the future, but it's about legislating values. So all those folks who are on the Hill and so forth, who are writing and all these different laws, whether it's about, the monetary spending, et cetera, all those things are value laden. And so my question is, how do Christians become think tanks for these types of legislations? How do we have values of abundant life? How do we bring the values of the love of neighbor? What if our economic system was built not on rugged individual and about how we can extract and be able to gain more of consumption, but an economic system that was built on the value of the love of neighbor versus the love of self? I mean, can you imagine what that would mean in terms of labor and production? Can you imagine what that would mean in terms of a livable wage? So to me, those are the ways in which like spirituality and faith get incorporated and built into the work of not only just entrepreneurship, but also in larger systems that are responsible for navigating and creating and legislating the values that we say that we care about or don't.
Stephen, that is great. And just as one aside, I realized we have got to send you, we did a paper that looks at REITs and alternative and community ownership, and did an inventory of the models that are happening in the United States and Europe. And if that is one of the questions that you have, we should send it to you, because if it's fodder for the work that you're doing, that would be fantastic. One of the things you talk about, because you're talking about seeing, and people need to be able to see differently and use different language differently. And you talked about kind of emancipating the imagination, which is a remarkable phrase, is, because I think one of the challenges people have sometimes in the economic realm is that the language of economics brings a normativity with it, or it appears to, and it can be difficult for people to maintain a focus both on the more substantive, important human values, as well as how do economic systems operate and how do we operate within economic systems. Sometimes people take for granted the structures of our markets, and they think, well, this is just how the world works. And then they try to work within it, as opposed to realizing that these are structures that we create, we design them, and we could design them differently. And we as a collective need to say, what values should our market serve, and how do we design our markets so that it actually realizes those values to the greatest extent possible. How do you and your work help kind of emancipate the imagination, to help people see just how much change is really possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we're constantly trying to do that now. Part of it is about exposure. I mean, at the end, what I think is at the heart of Do Good X is metanoia. It's a shift in the way we see, think, and act in our approach to business, but also the shift the way we see and think and act as it relates to our own invisible capital, or capital that we have that has been invisible to us? Like, how do we engage in the work of metanoia in our neighborhoods, in our entrepreneurial kind of development? Like, that seems to be core, I think, for us as we think about expanding people's kind of imagination. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Asia Marie Brown, but she wrote a book a few years ago that is about emergent strategy. And one of the things she talked about was that we have she says, we have a crisis of imagination. And part of that, I think, is looking at this idea that, we need, that our imagination, but what she says, we're in an imagination battle. And what she's going on to say is that, and she's talking about in a larger kind of social justice context, there's something in the psyche of our, in the broader community of America, their imagination that makes it possible that a Trayvon Brown and that a Trayvon Martin and a Mike Brown and all these folks that have been slayed under through malice means, because they were considered to be a threat. And so part of what she mentions is this idea of, oftentimes she feels trapped in someone else's imagination. And what we got to do is engage in, we have to break out of those type of prisms. And the only way that we can do that is when we relinquish investing in our own self-interest. And what that means is that you got to be able to be in spaces that are different from yours. Coming back to the story of the Good Samaritan. None of these folks want to help the Samaritan, but then you find this person who does or whatever. And so part of it is like, how do you put yourself in the perspective? How do you have empathy? Not just how do you have empathy, but how do you embody that kind of empathy that allows you to see from a very different perspective, social, economically, religious, theologically, et cetera, that then grows a third way or another way about what's possible that you hadn't been able to see before. And so part of this is about, if to do that, you have to be able to get entrepreneurs at least outside of their own comfort zone. To say it another way, you have to move people beyond their degree and level of certainty. I have this business that I'm working on. I have this idea that I actually want to do. I think I know how things actually work. Or do you now? And then what you do is you expose them to other people and perspectives that helps shift what they thought they knew, and maybe start to surface their own mental models and assumptions that operate just below the surface of awareness, but are the driving factors about why they do what they do, why they think what they think, and how they act. All that is a kind of metanoia that requires, again, the diversity of perspectives and worldviews to help you see what you can't see. And oftentimes we can't see it is because of our own formation and our socialization within this country. And so the more that you can get the right together with the left, the more that you can get middle class and wealthy white folks with poor people and folks don't look like them, the more that you can actually help people see and have to try on different languages and perspectives and interpretive kind of analysis, will help to expose and help to bloom the imagination that's possible. But our imaginations are, they're emaciated. They really need to be watered and nurtured. And I think that's one of the, benefits that someone like Coté and others bring from another country, because sometimes they can help us see what we can't see because we're like the fish in water. And so the question is, how do we value that kind of diversity and see that kind of diverse perspective and worldview, not as a threat, but it's something that's important for our own learning and our own growth and our own possibilities about what really is possible.
I feel that there is also a component of technical knowledge that needs to be more socialized. Because back to one of your questions, Stuart, about the how-tos, right? So I think that, like just by virtue of being in this conversation, many of us agrees that the economy needs to change. For example, Carrie was asking, how do we reconcile collective ownership with accumulation of private wealth? Really important questions. But to me, a lot of this has been learning the menial technicalities of LLCs and how powerful they are for real estate. And one of the reasons that I think probably I've started so many entities of different kinds is because I really love understanding these tools so that I can socialize these tools with others. So if somebody wants to start a business right now, it's like, I've started so many. So it's like, yeah, this is how you do it. Like, don't sweat it. And I really hope that, 2 years from now, Elizabeth in Lawndale, Bradley Johnson, we're all gonna be like, sure, you just start a community investment trust. This is how you do it. It's a no-brainer, So there is I'm just curious. So for example, like as we're trying to, as we get more bold and in making change happens, we do need knowledge on what are those infrastructures. So for example, when you approach a denomination and they really want to help you get that piece of land, or they really want to help you, and there is this whole conversation of like, well, but what are the terms? Are you asking for a bridge loan? Are you offering me ownership? Are you, and to me, it's been part of like the richness of these communities in these dialogues that we can just grab the phone and somebody will say like, yeah, dude, let just operate as a loan at 3 years at a 5%. That's actually great. I'm like, okay, great. Once we had that, boom, we were able to raise the capital, for example. So there is this black box when it comes to land and when it comes to business that I feel it's very powerful to socialize and be willing to be a student of these little details. I know it's menial. I mean, it sounds very like maybe boring, but at the end of the day, I think that that's been the perspective that I have brought as an outsider, is to understand, wow, this country really has laws that allow for entrepreneurship. One of the reasons I left Chile was because there wasn't room for somebody like me. Entrepreneurship is not really a thing in Chile, much less women doing anything daring. So I come to this country and I realized like, oh my gosh, the entire structure is done so that the cowboy can make as much money as he wants to. And thanks to the civil rights movement, the 200 years of prophetic work by Black communities in this country, we've been able to claim to the reality that is for everybody, right? So that we can take advantage of that for everybody, right? There is I agree with Carrie. There is a balance there. I've also seen in communities of color people who have gone over as a social justice crusade, but at the end of the day, it's for themselves, and that's fine. More power to them. But it's a little different than the collective growth of a community and flourishing of a community. It does help and it's necessary, but it's always a dance.
You were saying that it seems like it might be kind of mundane point, but I think it's actually, there's a profoundness to an importance to it, which is that too often finance and real estate, especially because some of the numbers get big, and it's cloaked in technical terminology in ways that kind of give real credence to the experts, and the experts who have grown up in maintaining the system the way that it is. And so it can be a real barrier for people to come in and say, okay, no, I'm going to be an agent here and decide what my community is going to look like, what this ownership is going to look like. I think there's a really powerful stance also having the courage and the confidence to be able to go into a place as a person who's learning, not the knower, but the person who's learning, the learner, to say, okay, these are just pieces that I can acquire to be able to undertake to achieve the results that I want for myself, for my community, for my family, for whomever it might be. And so I think that's a really powerful example. Even more than any specific technical knowledge is that ability to learn quickly how to carry these things out.
To figure it out.
Yeah, and that's which is central to entrepreneuring.
And then you start learning, sorry about that, then you start learning that maybe the thing that you thought was necessary wasn't. I just ran into one of our friends here, Curtis Brown, who kept talking about he said that we need to create a leverage fund. And I'm like, whatever, Curtis, move on, let's talk about the next thing. And as we are trying right now, for example, to hold this property for the neighborhood, like, and we got money to, like, how do we finance this? Like, oh my gosh, we don't have leverage. Hey, Curtis. Now, those are little things, for example. Or we have a whole, at the Cultural Space Agency, we have a constituency of, like, I don't know, 14 people on the council who, when we were submitting an offer, they were like, yeah, but are we on the hook to raise some money? Like, are we going to be in that? No, guys, you're not going to be in that. Oh, okay. Like little things that enable a whole group of people to take action on something.
No, I think you're right. And I think I want to underscore the kind of little black box in terms of the kind of technical knowledge. I mean, part of what we're at least trying to do at Do Good X is to democratize that business knowledge and make it more accessible to a wider content. Because folks, well, you can go and Google this and you can Google that, but someone has to codify that. And even though there may be a number of different financial instruments that you could possibly use to finance something, why pick, one over the other? What are the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages? And so I think you're right, Coté, really trying to democratize that access to that kind of technical knowledge is important. But the other piece I want to say too is that there's some things, Stuart, that are just, structural barriers to do the kind of work that we want to do, which is one of the reasons why you have like B corporations. But, the way that the corporate structure and the kind of tax and IRS are set up, like businesses are designed, legally structured to maximize shareholder interest. So unless you get into a B Corp and then you actually have a B Corp, you have the resources to stay up with all the kind of legislation and management to make sure that you're in compliance. People are kind of stuck in different type of legal. So those are the things that we can reimagine and restructure very easily. But I think also too, in terms of imagination, like part of what we need are neighborhoods, churches, and church leaders who are willing to be fugitives to the status quo. The status quo that says things have to be as they always have because this is the way it is, this is the way it has to be, and say, how can we work within the system, but not be of the system? I mean, we all, like, none of us are going to escape capitalism, right? And none of us are going to reimagine and change it to be something different overnight. But there are ways in which neighborhoods and neighborhood churches can come together and think about the ways in which they think about the production and think about consumption of smaller resources. There's a way in which they could leverage, blockchain technology and Bitcoins to create these type of microeconomies to actually build small laboratories where people can actually see and experiment and try on new things to see what's happened. Because part of what I think is that we need also new laboratories for experimentation to actually see a thing and what works and what doesn't work, and to be able to work those things out versus trying to get it all figured out in our head and then write some policy type of legislation and to see what might work out. So how do we, again, like shrink these big, massive things into small, manageable kinds of experiments that we then can partner with one of Coté's neighborhoods and say, let's try this, or let us figure out, like, we need to be all working more, I think, together than to work within our own particular set, because we all have pieces of the larger puzzle that I think will help benefit, abundant life, human flourishing, and the well-being for all.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that, entrepreneurship is not a theoretical exercise, right?
Correct.
You know where the goal is. You don't necessarily know where all the steps are to get to that goal because it hasn't been done yet. You're creating something new. You need to be able to try and fail and try again and redesign. One piece, though, that I would from my own perspective, would call out, and this is part of the story of the CLTs, is that, as we experiment wherever we stand, that we do so with an eye to the structural change that could be brought about. Because, that's an innovation that started with farmers in a rural context. It's not, if you thought, where's an idea that's going to come about that may change the way we deal with property ownership at large scale in major American cities, it's not the place you would have thought it was going to come from. But they push themselves to think beyond, okay, how do we just improve the situation, to, okay, what's a structural change that we can start to enact? Because, there are a bunch of other, there's a path, a migration kind of path for structural change to emerge, that goes from small citizen-led innovations to policymakers, to city, state, federal level, includes financial institution, new financial products. All of those players will eventually have to come in, but they need something to respond to. And the social entrepreneur who gives themselves permission to think that they can change the structure of our market is where it starts in many times. So I think that's an opportunity we all have in front of us.
And just the other thing too is that, it's not even all entrepreneurship, right? I mean, the pandemic has forced even churches as well as other entities to reimagine place in terms of work, or how we build community, or in a religious context, even how do you do church and Bible study and all those types of things. And we've been doing this for 2 years, right? And so the market will respond just to innovation. Not everything has to have a business model. Not everything has to be about building a particular business. Some things won't be able to have those things, but they need to be done. And so I just wanted to offer that, because I think that's also important too, that sometimes the innovations that you do within your neighborhood, whether it is, some community cooperation, or it's some kind of addressing an issue like a food desert, can then be what solicits, the kind of response that's needed to address a larger kind of systemic issue within the larger system that you may be trying to address as well.
I mean, again, it sucks to be an underdog in the system. On the other hand, not having, sorry, I don't know what is a four-letter word, what is that? Sorry, English is my second language still.
You're good.
I think I said one, I'm sorry. But there is a little bit of a grace, for example, in initiatives I have started that, that I couldn't access certain source of funding. For example, like when I was thinking about starting a Resistencia, I was thinking, a startup loan, and then I realized that does not exist. A startup loan is not a thing, which ended up having, we had to think a lot more innovatively about funding, which is paying off now. Like now that the stakes get a lot higher, and we're not raising 165,000 to start a business. We're raising 6 million to buy a very strategic piece of real estate. I'm more familiar with different arrangements and more tolerant of risk, and that to me is not only a blessing. It's been a blessing, but also it is the ground where innovation can grow, and it is the ground where disruptive systems can come from. And I love that opportunity. I love that it. Maybe I'm being overly resilient, but I love that it wasn't. I love that our solutions have not come from the usual the structures that are made for other people. Because anyway.
Yeah, all too often.
Sorry, I'm not being all brilliant. Sorry.
No, I think it's absolutely right. Is that all too often entrepreneurs, when they want to do something new, they have to invent the methodology also, and when they do that well, it kind of actually enables them to go further than they would. I'm
actually grateful for a large percentage of our neighborhood is undocumented, for example, undocumented migrants, and that presents us a whole set of challenges that are also it forces you to think pretty widely about, well, what is the role of the blockchain on this? How can we, okay, that is decentralized. Maybe maybe we need to learn more about that on behalf of these neighbors.
I think that's a really good point. And just we're almost out of time. Any last kind of closing thoughts? I'll pass it to Stephen and then Coté. Anything you want to share?
I'm just very enthusiastic about these movements of people who are thinking about thinking outside the box in the name of Jesus. Basically, it's encouraging to see to get a glimpse of the projects represented on the attendees by way of their questions in the chat, for example, and I'm encouraged to see the nomination executives and pastors and people who have access to assets and expertise to be part of these conversations. It's such a fun thing to think about as far as how to break systems to make how to pour new wines and new structures, basically. And oh my gosh, my English, I'm so sorry, guys. Nuevo vino and whatever. But this is a very exciting we are living a very exciting time that we're having to rethink everything and to have brought this community together around thinking in this way. It's fantastic. I'm missing Diamond Hart, just was supposed to meet us today. I feel his absence right now, as far as he's done incredible work in Indianapolis as well with his neighbors. Just naming him as a friend. New wine and new skins. Thank you, wineskins. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'll be forever grateful to you.
Yeah, I'll just close and say that, I agree, Coté. I think we're living in very exciting times. When I think about, the church's first innovation, Christians' first innovation, it was the church. It was a way in which, those deacons and other leaders said, how can we come together and actually, help the widows and those who are marginalized within our community. And from there, the church has sprung and has evolved over time. And I think there are people who are trying to find new ways to actually be. And so I just want to encourage everyone who's listening to say that, that it is possible to do things differently. And I would just say three things right quickly that, you can do really easily is that, first is that I think all of us, we have to divest from our own self-interest. We have to divest of our own kind of livelihood and our own excess, particularly here in this country. For those who are middle class and upper middle class, et cetera, like that is something that I think if we're going to embody or think about the ways in which faith intersects with finance and the ways in which the church can do, we have to be able to divest from our own self-interest. I think the other things that we have to do, we have to invest in lobbyists, politicians, economics policy holders, and those who can help educate us, but also help us think about the kinds of leaders who were working on behalf of those farmers in the 1960s to kind of put the types of policies in place that benefit more of us versus a few of us. And then thirdly, what I would say is that, I think we have to invest in community-centered enterprises. So it's like, what are the kinds of businesses that attend to the well-being and the strengthening of the community? Because the stronger that the community is to support those businesses, the better those businesses will be in supporting those communities and beyond. And I think, finally, what I would say is that, we have to model and honor the ingenuity of fugitive innovators, those who say, I'm going to be a fugitive to the status quo, that, I'm going to kind of create an alternative way of experimenting, and that way will lead on to way. with method and procedures, and that others will come along. Like we need to be able to see that. We have to be able to model that, and we have to be able to invest in those kind of leaders. So we need to be investing in folks like Coté and the kind of entrepreneurials that, you know, Ashoka is engaged in. Everyday people who are trying to make a difference with what they have as they try to live a life of meaning and purpose for the betterment of all.
As you were speaking, Steven, I was thinking there's nothing about the entrepreneurs who kind of are fugitives from the status quo. I was thinking, oh, there's nothing more punk rock than that. But then I kept thinking, I dreamed that in 10 years, somebody would say like, whoa, there's nothing more Christian than that, right? As in like taking risks as a spiritual practice and rethinking things and being bold. Just seems like a really great calling.
Indeed.
That is a wonderful kind of closing sentiment. Thank you both, Coté and Steven. I have learned a tremendous amount, and kind of definitely food for thought to rethink things. Thank you both for taking the time to share your stories and the work that you're doing. Thank you, Faith and Finance, for hosting this conversation, bringing together. You know, it was amazing to see just how many people joined the conversation, and you know, in some ways it would have been great if we actually had a large collective conversation with everybody, because there's so much insight on the call as well. So thank you all for this. I really look forward to kind of working with you as we seek to redesign the way our markets work so they work for the benefit of all.
Yes.
Rosalie,
Yes,
over to you.
I knew that was going to be a lot of fun. All three of those folks have so much to say about this space and are so energizing, don't you think? So thank you so much to Stuart, Coté, and Steven. Look forward to being in touch with you all again soon. And in the meantime, if you'd like to subscribe to our newsletter or to keep up with what we're doing at Faith and Finance, join us at faithfinance.net, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.